Hi, my name is Zoe, and I've always been the kind of person who believed in seeing the best in people. Maybe it's because of how I was raised, or maybe it's just who I am, but I've always tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, even when they didn't deserve it. I grew up in a loving household, though not without its challenges. My parents, Lawrence and Grace, worked hard to build a life of comfort and stability. They taught me the value of honesty, hard work, and standing up for what's right. When I met Peter, I thought I'd found someone who shared those values. He was charming, funny, and made me feel like I was the center of his world. At the time, I didn't see the red flags, or maybe I ignored them because I wanted so badly to believe in our love. I wanted to build a life with him, a life that felt secure and happy, just like the one my parents had created for me. What I didn't know was that the very people I let into my heart, Peter and his mother Julia, would become the source of my greatest betrayal. Looking back, there were signs, but I ignored them because I trusted too easily. This is the story of how I discovered the truth, how I reclaimed my life, and how I learned that sometimes the hardest battles we fight are with the people we love most. But more importantly, it's a story about finding strength in the face of betrayal and learning to value myself above all else. When I announced my engagement to Nick, my father's reaction wasn't what I expected. After dinner one night, he pulled me aside, his expression serious. "Ava, are you sure about this?" he asked. "Nick may seem charming, but I don't trust him, and his mother, Cheryl, worries me even more." "Why would you say that?" I asked, shocked. "Nick loves me, and Cheryl has always been kind." "What's wrong?" He sighed. "Call it a father's instinct. He talks too much about your money." I overheard him joking with his friends, saying he bagged the rich girl like it was some sort of achievement. "And Cheryl?" She laughed along with him. I shook my head. "Dad, you must have misunderstood. Nick loves me for who I am, not my family's money, and Cheryl would never encourage him to say something like that." But my father wasn't convinced. "I'm just asking you to be careful. Keep your eyes open." I brushed off his concerns. I was in love and believed in Nick and Cheryl. My father didn't understand how supportive they were. My mom had passed away 2 years earlier, and Dad was battling cancer. Nick and Cheryl had become my rock, or so I thought. My father's wealth came from years of hard work and smart investments. I earned a modest salary as a project manager and lived comfortably, thanks in part to occasional help from my dad. Nick, on the other hand, had a decent job in sales but came from a humble background. Cheryl worked part-time at a boutique but often complained about how little money she had. After our wedding, I invited Nick and Cheryl to live in my townhouse. It wasn't a mansion, but it was cozy. That wasn't enough for them. "Why don't you ask your dad to help you upgrade?" Cheryl said one evening as we sat in the living room. "You deserve something better, Ava." Nick chimed in. "She's right. Your dad's place is massive. He doesn't need all that space by himself. You could swap houses." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "That house is my dad's. He deserves to live there comfortably." Cheryl's lips tightened. "Well, he's not going to be around forever, is he? Eventually, it will all be yours. Why not start planning now?" The way she casually talked about my father's death made me uncomfortable. Over time, her comments grew more frequent, and I began to see a pattern. She and Nick weren't just interested in my dad's comfort. They were already planning how to spend my inheritance. When my father passed away, I was devastated. Organizing the funeral and managing my grief was overwhelming, and I got no support from Nick or Cheryl. They didn't even attend the funeral. "We didn't know him that well," Cheryl said, shrugging. "Instead, they asked me about the will." "When do you find out what he left you?" Nick asked casually. I couldn't believe their lack of empathy. "Can you give me some time?" I snapped. "I just lost my father." At the will reading, I learned that my father had left most of his wealth to charity. The only thing I inherited was a neighborhood of rental properties, which I wouldn't officially own for another year. My dad had set it up that way intentionally, ensuring I'd have time to reflect on who deserved to share my life. When I returned home, Nick and Cheryl were waiting like vultures. "So, what did he leave you?" Cheryl asked, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. I decided to test them. "Nothing," I lied. "Dad donated everything to charity." Cheryl's jaw dropped. "What? That doesn't make sense. He was so wealthy. He must have left you something." Nick's face darkened. "You're lying. There's no way he left you with nothing." I shrugged. "Believe what you want, but there's no money coming my way." Cheryl's disappointment quickly turned to frustration. You need to contest the will. That money should be yours. No, I said firmly. It was my dad's decision, and I respect it. From that moment, their behavior changed. Nick grew distant, his affection replaced by cold indifference. Cheryl stopped pretending to be polite, treating me like a burden instead of family. I started to see them for who they really were, and it broke my heart. But the worst was yet to come. The months after our wedding were a whirlwind of settling into our new lives together. Peter moved into my modest townhouse, and Julia soon followed. I tried to be understanding. It wasn't easy for her to live alone after losing her husband. She said she would stay just a few months to get back on her feet, but her presence quickly became a fixture in our lives. At first, I tried to make them feel at home. I cooked dinners, invited them to join me in family traditions, and even rearranged my work schedule to accommodate Julia's preferences. I thought I was building a family, but little by little, the cracks in the foundation started to show. Julia wasted no time pointing out the flaws in my house. "It's so small," she said one morning over coffee, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing to the living room. "Your father lives in that beautiful mansion all by himself, and you're stuck here. It's just not fair." I clenched my teeth, trying to stay polite. "This house is mine, Julia. I saved for years to buy it, and my dad helped me with the down payment. I'm proud of what I've accomplished." "Well," she sniffed, "if your father is helping you, he could have set you up with something better. After all, he has so much space he doesn't use. Wouldn't it make sense for him to trade houses with you? He could live here comfortably, and you could have the mansion." I laughed awkwardly, hoping to defuse the situation. "That's not going to happen. Dad worked hard for what he has, and he deserves to enjoy it." Julia didn't seem to appreciate my answer. Peter chimed in. "Mom's right, though. Your dad doesn't need all that space. You could at least talk to him about it." "No, Peter," I said firmly. "It's his house. End of discussion." The idea didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Julia made increasingly pointed remarks about my dad's wealth and how unfair it was that he wasn't doing more for me, and, by extension, them. She even suggested I ask him for money to renovate my house or buy a bigger one. Each time I shut her down, but her persistence wore on me. Peter, too, began to change. At first he was sweet and affectionate, helping around the house and showering me with compliments. But as Julia's influence grew, he became distant. He started making offhand comments about how he thought things would be different and expected more from our life together. When I asked him to explain, he brushed me off, saying he was just stressed from work. It all came to a head one evening when Julia cornered me in the kitchen. "Zoe," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "I hope you don't think I'm overstepping, but you really should start thinking about your future. Your father isn't getting any younger, and when he passes, everything will come to you. That money could make life so much easier for you and Peter." My stomach turned. "Julia, I don't want to think about my dad dying, and even if I did inherit anything, it wouldn't be for us to spend frivolously." She waved me off. "You're so naive. It's not frivolous to want a better life. Peter and I have struggled for so long. We deserve some comfort. You've lived in my house rent-free for months, Julia," I snapped. "Isn't that enough comfort for you?" Her eyes narrowed, and I instantly regretted my words. "You're so ungrateful," she hissed. "Peter and I sacrificed so much for you. He gave up his freedom to marry you, and I've done nothing but help you around here. The least you could do is show a little appreciation." I didn't have the energy to argue, so I walked away, leaving her fuming in the kitchen. That night, I lay awake, my father's words echoing in my mind. "This man doesn't love you, Zoe. He loves what you have." For the first time, I began to wonder if he was right. A few weeks later, my father's cancer took a turn for the worse. He passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving me shattered. I barely had time to grieve before Julia and Peter turned their attention to the inevitable reading of the will. "When do we get to hear what your dad left you?" Julia asked, barely a day after the funeral. I stared at her, incredulous. "We! It's not your inheritance, Julia." She shrugged, unbothered by my anger. "Well, you are my daughter-in-law, and Peter is your husband. What's yours is his, and what's his is mine." I couldn't believe the audacity. "My father just died," I said, my voice shaking. "And all you can think about is money? It's not like he was my father," she said, rolling her eyes. "I'm just being practical." Peter, to my disappointment, didn't defend me. Instead, he quietly agreed with his mother, saying we needed to plan for our future. It felt like a betrayal. The day of the will reading came, and I went alone. Peter and Julia were furious, insisting they had a right to be there. But I stood my ground. This is my family's business, I said firmly. Not yours. The lawyer's office was a cold, sterile place, but the words on the page were warm and full of love. My father had left me his estate, but with one important caveat: the financial assets would remain in trust for a year. He wanted me to take time to evaluate my life and the people in it. It was his final lesson, a way to protect me even after he was gone. When I returned home, Julia and Peter were waiting like vultures. Well, Julia demanded, how much did he leave you? Nothing, I lied. There was no money. Everything was donated to charity. Their faces fell, and for a moment, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. But that satisfaction quickly turned to heartbreak when Peter said, "What a waste of time. I married you for nothing." Those words cut deeper than I thought possible, and for the first time, I saw them for who they truly were: selfish, greedy, and incapable of love. Something inside me broke, and I knew things could never go back to the way they were. This was the beginning of the end. Peter's words haunted me for days. I kept replaying them in my head, wondering how I could have been so blind. My grief for my father was already heavy, but now I had to contend with the reality that my marriage was built on lies. Peter and Julia didn't let up, though. Even after I told them I hadn't inherited anything, they constantly questioned me. Julia was relentless, dropping hints and accusations. "Are you sure there's no money? Maybe the lawyer didn't tell you everything. Rich people always have secret accounts." Peter wasn't much better. "I just don't understand," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. "Your dad was so wealthy and now there's nothing? It doesn't make sense." "I don't know what to tell you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I didn't get any money, and that's the end of it." He sighed dramatically, running a hand through his hair. "It's just, I thought we'd be able to start fresh. Maybe buy a bigger house, pay off some debts. It's not like I'm asking for much, Zoe." I stared at him, my patience wearing thin. "We're not struggling, Peter. We have a roof over our heads, food on the table, and everything we need. Why isn't that enough for you?" He didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. It wasn't enough because it would never be enough. A month passed and their behavior only grew worse. Julia started to act like I didn't exist, ignoring me completely unless she needed something. Peter became distant, spending more time at work or out with friends. When he was home, he barely spoke to me. The warmth and affection that once defined our relationship were gone, replaced by cold indifference. One night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried through the house. "This is ridiculous," Julia said, her tone sharp. "We wasted years on her and she's not even worth it." "I told you to marry someone with real money, Peter." "I didn't know," Peter replied, sounding frustrated. "I thought her dad would leave her everything. How was I supposed to know he'd give it all away?" "Well, it's time to cut our losses," Julia snapped. "Divorce her and move on. There's no reason to stay with her now." My heart stopped. I stood frozen in the hallway, their words cutting me like a knife. They weren't even trying to hide their intentions anymore. When I confronted Peter the next day, he didn't deny anything. "What do you want me to say, Zoe?" he said, throwing up his hands. "You lied to me. I thought I was marrying into a better life, but you didn't come with anything. This marriage was a mistake." I stared at him in disbelief. "A mistake? I loved you, Peter. I thought you loved me too. I cared about you," he said, his tone dismissive. "But love isn't enough. We need more than that," Julia chimed in, as always. "Peter deserves someone who can provide for him, Zoe. Someone who can help him build a future. It's obvious you're not that person." The audacity of her words stunned me into silence. For years, I had supported Peter, welcomed his mother into my home, and given them everything I could. And now, they were treating me like I was the problem. But instead of breaking down, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. "If you want a divorce, Peter, you'll get one," I said, my voice steady. "But it's going to be on my terms." He looked surprised, but quickly recovered. "Fine, let's make it mutual. No alimony, no splitting assets. We'll both walk away with what we brought into the marriage." I nodded. "Agreed. I'll have the papers drawn up." Julia smirked, clearly pleased with my lack of resistance. "Smart choice," she said. You don't have much to lose anyway. What they didn't realize was that I was finally taking control of my life. I wasn't going to let them dictate the terms anymore. Over the next few weeks, I started making preparations. I moved Peter and Julia into a rented apartment nearby, giving them no reason to stay in my house. They didn't question my decision, too eager to get out and move on with their lives. Peter seemed relieved, even excited, as if he were finally free of a burden. What they didn't know was that I was free too. Free from their manipulation, their greed, and their constant drain on my happiness. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The day our divorce was finalized, I dropped off my wedding ring at Peter's new place. Julia opened the door, her expression smug. "Here to say goodbye, Zoe?" she asked. I held up the ring box. "I thought Peter might want these back. They don't mean anything to me anymore." Peter appeared behind her, looking annoyed. "You didn't have to come all the way here for that," he said. "Just throw them away." I laughed, shaking my head. "You really don't get it, do you? This was never about the money or the rings. It was about finally being done with you." Julia scoffed. "Don't act so high and mighty, Zoe. We know the truth. Your parents didn't leave you anything because they wasted their fortune. You're just as broke as we are now." Her words made me laugh even harder. "Is that what you think?" I said, unable to hide my amusement. "You really have no idea, do you?" Peter frowned. "What are you talking about?" I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough to make them strain to hear. "I didn't lie about my inheritance. I just didn't tell you the whole truth. My parents didn't leave me money. They left me this entire neighborhood." Their faces went pale. "What?" Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's right," I said, relishing their shock. "Every house on this block belongs to me, including the one you're renting." Julia sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. Peter just stared at me, his mouth hanging open. "And don't worry," I added, turning to leave. "Your lease is up soon. I'll make sure you get plenty of notice before I evict you." For the first time in months, I felt truly free. Peter and Julia had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. As I walked away, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and I was finally writing it on my own terms. After dropping the bombshell about my inheritance, I left Peter and Julia's apartment with a renewed sense of clarity. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer the victim in their game. They had underestimated me, and now they were scrambling to figure out their next move. True to form, Julia didn't waste time trying to win me over. She showed up at my door the very next morning, her expression oscillating between forced sincerity and thinly veiled panic. "Zoe," she began, clasping her hands in front of her like she was about to pray. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot yesterday. I've been thinking about what you said, and I believe there's still a chance for us to fix things as a family." I raised an eyebrow. "Fix things? You mean after you both admitted to using me for money and then tried to kick me to the curb?" Julia's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "I know we've made mistakes, but families forgive each other. Surely you don't want to hold on to bitterness? It's not good for anyone." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Julia, let me be very clear. I don't owe you or Peter anything. You used me, betrayed my trust, and now that you've realized you miscalculated, you want to act like we're all one big happy family. That's not going to happen." Her mask of civility cracked, and the desperation seeped through. "You can't do this to us, Zoe. You know how hard things have been for Peter and me. If you kick us out of this apartment, we'll have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem," I said coolly. "You made your choices, Julia. Now you have to live with the consequences." She opened her mouth to argue, but I shut the door in her face before she could say another word. I leaned against it, exhaling deeply. It felt good to stand up for myself, but the reality of what lay ahead was daunting. Evicting them wouldn't be easy, and I knew they wouldn't go quietly. Over the next few weeks, their behavior escalated. Julia left voicemails, alternating between pleading and threatening. Peter sent me text messages, claiming he wanted to make amends, though his words always rang hollow. Once, I even caught Julia lurking outside my house, watching me through the window like some kind of deranged stalker. It was unnerving, but I refused to let them intimidate me. Instead, I focused on preparing for the next steps. With the help of the estate manager my parents had appointed, I finalized the transfer of the neighborhood properties into my name. It was a tedious process, but every signature and notarized document felt like another nail in the coffin of Peter and Julia's plans. By the time the transfer was complete, I was ready to take action. I served them an official eviction notice, giving them 30 days to vacate the apartment. Predictably, they didn't take it well. Julia showed up at my house again, this time with Peter in tow. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days, while Julia's face was twisted with barely contained rage. "You can't do this, Zoe," Peter said, his voice trembling. "We're your family." "Family?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You're joking, right? You made it clear that I was nothing more than a meal ticket to you. Don't try to play the family card now." Julia stepped forward, her tone sharp. "You're being petty and vindictive. Do you really think this makes you better than us?" "It's not about being better," I shot back. "It's about protecting myself from people who only see me as a bank account." Peter's expression darkened. "You're going to regret this, Zoe. We'll fight you on this. We'll make your life miserable." "Go ahead and try," I said, crossing my arms. "But remember, I hold all the cards now. Good luck finding a lawyer who'll take your case when you've already signed a lease agreement that gives me the right to evict you." Julia opened her mouth to argue, but Peter grabbed her arm and pulled her away. "Let's go," he muttered. "We'll figure something out." As they walked away, I felt a pang of sadness mixed with relief. Sadness for the love I had once felt for Peter and the hope I'd had for our marriage. Relief because I was finally free of their toxic influence. The weeks that followed were chaotic. Julia and Peter tried everything to delay the eviction, from filing baseless complaints with the estate manager to showing up unannounced at my house to beg for more time. But I stood firm, refusing to let them manipulate me any longer. Eventually, the day came when they had to leave. I watched from a distance as movers hauled their belongings out of the apartment. Julia's face was a mask of fury, while Peter looked like a man defeated. They didn't say goodbye, and I didn't expect them to. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight to reclaim my life, it had all brought me to this point. And though it hadn't been easy, I felt stronger for having endured it. I thought about my parents, about the wisdom and foresight they had shown in protecting me from people like Peter and Julia. They had seen through their facade long before I did, and for that, I would always be grateful. As I looked around my home, I realized it felt different now. Lighter, freer. For the first time in years, I felt like it was truly mine. And though there were still challenges ahead, I knew I could face them with confidence. This was my life, my story, and I was finally in control. The day Julia and Peter officially left my property marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Watching their car drive off, filled to the brim with hastily packed belongings, felt like the final release of a burden I'd carried for far too long. I had given them every opportunity to treat me with respect, to show some semblance of decency, and they had squandered it every time. For a moment, I allowed myself to grieve, not for them, but for the version of me that had once believed in Peter, that had once loved him and trusted him with my heart. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone wiser, someone stronger, and as painful as the journey had been, I was finally learning to value myself in a way I never had before. A week after their eviction, I received a call from one of Peter's old co-workers. To my surprise, the man wasn't calling to gossip or offer condolences. He was calling to warn me. "Zoe, I thought you should know," he said, his tone cautious. "Peter's been spreading rumors about you at the office." "Rumors?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "What kind of rumors?" "He's telling people you're bitter and vindictive, that you kicked him out of the house out of spite and tried to ruin his life." I didn't believe him, but "you might want to be careful. He seems desperate." Desperate. The word echoed in my mind long after I ended the call. I knew Peter and Julia wouldn't go quietly, but hearing that they were actively trying to smear my name made my blood boil. Still, I resolved not to let their antics distract me. I had worked too hard to get to this point, and I wasn't about to let them drag me down again. Instead, I focused on reclaiming my life. With the neighborhood properties officially transferred into my name, I began working with the estate manager to develop a plan for the future. Many of the tenants had no idea their landlord had changed, and I intended to keep it that way. My parents had built this portfolio with the intention of creating a stable income for me, and I was determined to honor their vision. But managing an entire neighborhood was no small feat. Between coordinating with contractors for maintenance, responding to tenant inquiries, and navigating the endless paperwork that came with property ownership, I found myself busier than ever. It was overwhelming at times, but it was also rewarding. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, a sense that I was building something meaningful, not just for myself, but for the community my parents had cared about so deeply. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Peter and Julia continued to be a thorn in my side, showing up unannounced at my house on more than one occasion. Each time, they would alternate between begging for forgiveness and hurling insults, as if one tactic might work better than the other. One particularly rainy evening, they arrived soaking wet and visibly distraught. Peter looked more disheveled than I'd ever seen him, his hair sticking to his forehead, and his clothes wrinkled and damp. Julia, on the other hand, still carried herself with that same air of entitlement, though her mascara-streaked cheeks betrayed her desperation. "Zoe, please," Peter started, his voice cracking. "We have nowhere else to go. The eviction is on our record now, and no one will rent to us. Just give us one more chance." I stared at them, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to say, but instead of unleashing my anger, I took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "You had your chance, Peter. Both of you did. And instead of treating me with kindness and respect, you used me, lied to me, and threw me away when you thought I was no longer useful. I owe you nothing." Julia stepped forward, her voice shrill. "You're heartless, Zoe. After everything we've been through together, you're really going to leave us out in the cold?" I crossed my arms, unflinching. "Everything we've been through? You mean the years you spent manipulating me and plotting to take my inheritance? The way you dismissed my grief when my father died? The way you told Peter to divorce me the second you thought I had nothing to offer? That's what you call everything we've been through?" For once, Julia had no response. She opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water, searching for the right words but finding none. "I suggest you both leave," I said firmly. "And don't come back. If you do, I won't hesitate to call the police." Peter looked like he wanted to argue, but Julia grabbed his arm and pulled him away. "Come on, Peter," she muttered, her voice laced with bitterness. "She's made her decision." As they walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, and a lingering sadness for the love I had once given so freely. But I knew I had made the right choice. They had chosen their path, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The next day, I took the first steps toward securing a restraining order. It wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about sending a clear message that I would no longer tolerate their behavior. With the help of a lawyer, I gathered all the evidence I needed: their harassment, the texts and voicemails, even the landlord's testimony about their refusal to leave peacefully. Filing the paperwork felt like closing a chapter of my life. For so long, I had let Peter and Julia's actions dictate my emotions, my decisions, and my sense of self-worth. But now, I was taking control. I was choosing to move forward, to build a life free from their toxicity. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. The restraining order brought a sense of finality that I hadn't felt before. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the constant fear of Peter and Julia showing up unannounced, demanding more of me than I was willing to give. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and delivered, and I was finally free of their reach. But freedom wasn't just about physical distance. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself that I had given away: my confidence, my peace, and my sense of worth. I began to focus on the things that mattered to me, like improving the properties my parents had left behind and nurturing the friendships that had supported me through the chaos. Emma, my best friend, was a constant presence, her unwavering belief in me reminding me that I deserved better than what I'd endured. One evening, while reviewing tenant feedback, I stumbled upon a heartfelt letter left anonymously in the neighborhood drop box. The tenant thanked me for maintaining the property so well, for being approachable, and for creating a community that felt like home. It was a small thing, But it meant everything. It reminded me of why my parents had invested in these homes, to provide stability and comfort for people who needed it. I spent more time walking through the neighborhood, talking to tenants, and making small improvements that had been neglected for years. It was fulfilling in a way I hadn't expected, and it gave me a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Peter and Julia, on the other hand, were struggling. Word spread quickly about their eviction, their behavior, and the circumstances surrounding their departure. They had burned so many bridges that even their closest friends wanted nothing to do with them. I later heard that they'd left town altogether, forced to start over in a new city. I felt no pity for them, only a sense of justice. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. Months passed, and with each day I felt lighter. My heartache began to fade, replaced by a quiet pride in how far I'd come. I started exploring new hobbies, traveling to places I'd always wanted to see, and even opened myself up to the possibility of love again, not because I needed it, but because I was ready. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found a handwritten letter from my father. His words were as clear and steady as I remembered him to be. "Zoe," he'd written, "never forget your worth. You are more than what anyone gives you or takes from you. You are enough, just as you are." Tears filled my eyes as I read the letter, his wisdom and love washing over me. It was a reminder of everything I'd fought for, of the strength I'd always carried within me, but had forgotten along the way. My parents' legacy wasn't just the properties or the inheritance. It was the values they'd instilled in me, values that had guided me through the darkest times and brought me to where I was now. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The scars from my marriage and the betrayal of those I'd once trusted were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to live with them, to see them as proof of my resilience, rather than reminders of my pain. This was my life now, mine to shape, mine to cherish, and mine to protect. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, I knew I was finally free, free to move forward, free to love myself, and free to build a future that was as bright as the stars above.